You're good. You're good to go.
Okay. Well, as some of you may have noticed, we are in our 250th year as a country, and there are some things that are being prepared, some things that have been talked about and all that, and it is a big deal for a country to have lasted that long. There have certainly been some that lasted longer, but not very many. And while we certainly have many, many problems, and always have had, to come to this point in our nation's history is really a historical arena. There are some historical events that can be made between the United States and the church. Now, I'm not suggesting that God saw to it that the United States is somehow blessed more than anybody else. I know there's some people who think that. I do think that our nation has been blessed, but I don't see it as something like the new Israel from the old times in the old covenant of God's chosen people or something like that. Some believe that, and we can certainly look and see how our nation has prospered compared to many in the world and draw various conclusions about that. But still, we somehow find that we are a special people because of who we are in this nation as a nation is really hard to find in the Bible. So, but anyway, the point I want to talk about tonight is we have a Constitution in the United States, and it was created over a couple of years, and it had input from a lot of people. One thing that I have always said, kind of as a way of talking about those people, is I always said Thomas Jefferson and friends. Now, I don't mean that Thomas Jefferson was solely responsible for all of the things that we have in this country. He was a significant part of the Declaration of Independence, and he had a lot to say. And I struggle sometimes with people who want to say that there were so many things that were not done right in those days, and you think, well, you know, are you really smarter than Thomas Jefferson? Maybe you are, but it's not likely. But anyway, when I say that, I don't really mean him personally, but there was a group of men, people at that time that had a lot of input into the way this country first separated from England and then founded our own nation. And so, just as a side note from what I've read recently, is Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of the great names of our history, they were overseas as ambassadors, I think, to England and France while the Constitution was being written, so they didn't have a lot of input into it. I'm sure they might have corresponded, but you know, when you wrote a letter and you were in England, it might take a month to get to the United States, and then who knows how much longer to get to you. So there was a lot of delay in those days. So in spite of me saying Thomas Jefferson and friends, those two, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, really didn't have a lot of input into the actual writing of our Constitution. I'll get to the part about this and God in a minute, but I feel like a little bit of background is really useful. The main authors of the Constitution were Alexander Hamilton, who's been made famous the last few years for a play, James Madison, who was a president pretty early in there, and then a man named John Jay. And that was a man that probably we've never heard of unless you were really a history nerd in school. But they were the primary writers of the Constitution. If you want to really know what the Constitution means, take a look at the Federalist Papers, and that gives you an idea because they explain why things were said in the Constitution. Now, that's a historical thing that, as a citizen of this country, we ought to know better. And just as a side note, when I was looking this up, and this obviously has nothing to do with it, but it was just such a coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidences very often, but I think this one really was. The actual person who wrote the Declaration of the Constitution, who actually sat down and wrote it, what we would call a scribe, he didn't have input into the words, but he was the best handwriting they could find, is the best way to say it. And he wrote the Constitution. His name was Jacob Shallis. And you know what he got paid? $30. 30 pieces of silver. Again, I think that's just a strange coincidence. That document was not perfect by some degree, but they spent a lot of time and effort trying to make that document perfect. And they made provisions to amend it. You know, we have the ability to amend that document. Now, they immediately did it, what we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They did that immediately because they knew those things needed to be part of it. But they made a process where one day people could make changes to it because they recognized that they were really, I don't want to say they were prideful in it, but they knew they had put together a great document. But they also knew they weren't perfect and they knew times change. And so they set up a system where you could make changes to it. Now, not easily, but could make changes. If enough people and enough states and enough input was made, they could make changes to it. So that they didn't have so much restrictions or so many things written that just could not be changed. And our Supreme Court is designed to focus their minds on that document and those amendments, and to make decisions based on that until those things are changed. Altogether, there's 27 amendments. Again, the first 10 plus 17 more that have been made over the next 248 years, I guess, something like that. But anyway, 17 in the last 250 years or so. And if you really sit down and look at those things, most of them did not really make the country better. They did not make the document better. Some of them did, but for the most part, they were not, in my opinion, they were not in the best interest of the United States. But the majority of the people in the states voted for them, and that's the law of the land. And again, the people that wrote it were probably smarter than the people who tried to amend it. Now, I've said all that, but to make the point that amendments to the Constitution, as much as we should respect and admire it, they are necessary because they weren't perfect. They were good, but they weren't perfect. Well, what we have is what you could call a Constitution. We have a rule book, a set of rules and regulations to live by that came from God and Christ and written by the apostles and some others at that time, who laid down the rule book, what we can loosely say our Constitution to be the church. It explains all that's needed to be the church to function forever. And it was completed in the first century. The charter this morning made the point that at the very first, they didn't have all this stuff written down. And so there was necessity to repeat things. There was necessity to show the power. There was all these things. But once the Constitution, I'm going to keep referring it to that, once that was written down as our rule book of behavior, there wasn't a need for all those other things. But we have this, and there's not a provision for amendments. We can look in the first century and we can see that those men who wrote these things were already warning about things that would be brought in, new ideas, different suggestions, all these various kinds of things. Some of those people had evil intents to destroy the church. Others were, I'll say, didn't have an evil intent, but they hadn't really thought it through. They were trying to help God. Well, God doesn't really need help. But those changes were not authorized. There is no provision for amendments to God's directives to us. There's no provision for that because, unlike the great men of our history, God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't need to have things changed. we can look in Galatians 1:8. I should have had this already opened up to there. We can look in Galatians 1:8, and he says, "But even if we," meaning himself, "or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we preach to you, let him be accursed." And then he repeats it in verse 9 to make the emphasis of the point. Get that point. You know, that our founding fathers put in there, if you realize we've made a mistake, here's how to fix it. God didn't make a mistake. He did not put in a way to fix it because it didn't need fixing. And even the apostles who say, Paul writing to the Galatians, if I, Paul, say something different than I told you before, then don't listen to me now. Remember what I said then. Again, as we look at our Constitution and our nation, we can look back at those times, and they meant what they said. Now, again, they weren't perfect, but they meant what they said. It's not really subject to interpretation. It could be subject to change, but it's not subject to interpretation. Like that, God's Word is not subject to change. Again, we can be confused about something God or one of the apostles said, but we don't have permission to change it. And our goal would be to try to figure out what we're confused about and be unconfused no more, or be confused no more. So that was set up to once and for all, and it doesn't need changing. Paul did not say we should respect other beliefs. God did not say we should be patient and understanding with those trying to change the gospel because they think they have a better idea. Now again, we can be kind, we can be loving, we can be gentle in our approach, but our gentleness and approach is not to agree with error just to be nice. We need to be nice, but we don't need to just let anything and everything happen in order to say, well, we're at peace. Well, that doesn't last. And any change after the first century, when these things were written down for our learning, when any change after that we read about from what we see in the Bible, any change after that is wrong. He says it's anathema. 2 Corinthians 11:4 will talk about false teachers. So when we look at anything, however old it may be, again, not to pick on anybody in particular, but when we look at various denominations who were formed during the last 2,000 years, and we look at what some people would call the Catholic Church, it is a lot older than the Baptist Church or the Methodist Church, or the Presbyterian Church, or these other churches. They are older, but they are not what was set forth in the first century. Our goal is to find out what that is. It's one of the reasons we study. But any church, any gospel, anything that was founded later has to be wrong if it varies at all with what they said in the New Testament. And since those all vary a little or a lot, maybe just a little, but they vary, then they cannot be right. We need to make sure that we are right. And the way we do that is why we study. We don't just sit, and I love the singing and all that, but we don't just sit here and sing. We don't just sit here and listen to somebody talk to us. We don't just sit here and nod off, so to speak, and go, yep, whatever they say must be right. No. We have to be careful at what is said. Matches what God laid down for us. Again, like the Supreme Court in our nation is designed to say, this is what the Constitution says. If your request, Kentucky State or company or whatever entity, if your request to the Supreme Court of this nation is in conflict with the Constitution, then you're just wrong, and you should lose. Now, again, everyone is flawed. People are not perfect, but that's the design, is to say this is in accordance with the Constitution or this is not. Our Constitution is the New Testament. and anything we do should be in accordance with it, and if it's not, we need to fix that. So I appreciate it if you all would think on these things while we stand and sing.
Bring Christ your broken life, so marred by sin. He will create anew, make whole again. Your empty, wasted years